So let's talk about ecology and then terrestrial biomes. So ecology is basically the study of the interactions between organisms, living things, and their environment. And so obviously this is really important with environmental science because that's kind of what environmental science talks about too, is the environment. And so, like, for example, on a FRQ, if they ask you about ecology, they want you to give a reason that talks about how organisms are related to the environment or how they interact with their environment. So you can't just say, oh, it'll hurt biodiversity. How? Right? What will happen if you lose this species? You know, that kind of thing. So now let's talk about a species. Basically, a species is anything that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So that is an important note. The offspring must be fertile. Your offspring must be able to have babies. Closely related species are classified into genera or like it's like a genus. I never get the plural pronounced right. And then your scientific name is always Latin and has two parts, the genus and the species. So for the panda, for example, it's Aluropoda melanoluca. Some important things about it, it's always in italics. So if you're writing it by hand, you'll want to underline. The genus is the first one, and that is always capital. And the species is the second word, and that is always lowercase. So a population is basically a group of individuals that can reproduce together. So it's like a group of individuals of the same species, like living in the same spot, somewhere where they can reproduce. And you can have different populations. For example, we could have the human population of Georgia. We could have the human population of the United States. We could have the human population of North America, or we could have the human population of the entire world. Okay, so it's just, you know, it's up to you to decide what population you're talking about. A biota is like a grouping of populations. Biotic community is living organisms, and then abiotic has that prefix A, so it means non-living. Ecosystems are basically where you have a bunch of communities, multiple populations of different species, and they're all living in the same area. Okay, a lot of times ecosystems tend not to have distinct boundaries. For example, you know, if you have like a forest, you may just start like getting, you know, like smaller trees, and then like shrubs, and then all of a sudden you've got like a grassland. There's not necessarily like a place where you have like a tree and then grassland. It's usually naturally not like that. Usually there's some sort of, you know, transition. Okay, and they call that basically the ecotone, that transitional area. So like this is obviously forest. This is obviously grassland. That area in between that's not really a forest. It's not really a grassland. It's something in between. You could call that like an ecotone, that transitional region. So here's kind of what I was talking about. So you can see that you know, this is definitely a forest. This is definitely a grassland. And then in here, we've got some small trees, some shrubs, some grass, things like that. That would be an ecotone, the thing in between, the area kind of in between that kind of joins the two. This is the same thing in an aquatic ecosystem. So this is definitely land. You know, it's above, if you say have like a tide or something like that, it's above high tide. This is definitely aquatic. There's, you know, everything here is underwater. But then you have this transitional ecosystem where you've got some land, you've got some water, and you've got some critters that kind of live in the middle, we would call that like a ecotone. And then landscapes are just clusters of interacting ecosystems. So, you know, where you've got that land area and the aquatic, that whole area could be considered the landscape. And then a biome is a very large area of Earth's surface that has the same climate and similar vegetation. And again, there's not sharp boundaries between biomes. It's not like there's a wall or anything between the biomes. There's a, you know, it's gradual. And so that's really the focus of today is the biome. So we needed to kind of get some of this this background knowledge in order to understand these biomes. And then your biosphere, the entire world, all the living things on Earth are in the biosphere. So this is an interesting quote. The reason I like to use it is just because we think about the biosphere as being this big area, right? Trees are really tall, the ecosystem above that, you know, but this is saying if you shrink Earth to the size of a basketball, the biosphere, the area where all of the living things live, is thinner than a layer of saran wrap. Okay, so it's very thin. It's not this. You think of it as a thick area because, you know, trees seem really tall, and you look up and you see trees and you see birds flying and things like that. So you think that it's this really tall, broad area, you know, the bottom of the ocean to the top of the atmosphere where things live. That seems like a really tall area, right? Miles and miles. But in the scheme of the planet, it's actually very, very thin. So now we can talk about environmental factors, and these are things that change based on, you know, your location on planet Earth. So conditions are things that vary in space or time, but they don't get used up. Okay, so like sunlight, temperature, rainfall, this isn't stuff that gets used up. Everyone has access to the rain, everyone has access to the temperature, and everyone has access to the sunlight, right? That doesn't, it's not like, oh, well, only these folks get the temperature, right? Everyone gets the temperature, right? It's not something that you can use up or you can hoard. Everyone shares it. And then resources are things that are consumed. So these are things that folks could compete over. For example, food, shelter, things like that. And then the amount of each resource and condition that is present in the atmosphere or present in that area determines who can survive there and who cannot. So now we can discuss tolerance, because some species thrive in certain levels. So we call this a tolerance. So your optimum is where you can grow the best. Okay, so the optimum is right in the middle. You see this plant is very, very tall. It's growing really well. Anything outside of that optimum is going to be a little stressful for that plant, and it's not going to, or like animal, and it's not going to grow as well as it could in that optimal. It can survive, but it's not going to grow really, really well. Okay, and then your range of tolerance is the entire area where you can actually grow. So, for example, this plant can grow in this entire area, so this is the range of tolerance, and you see that here. Anything outside of this little bell curve, the plant can't grow, and so the plant will die. And it's either because it's too cold or it's too hot or whatever. There's not enough rain, there's too much rain, whatever it is, the plant can't grow in those extremes. So you've got your optimal, and then those areas that are not in the optimal, but the plant or organism can still survive, these little like triangles right here, we call those zones of stress. Okay, so that's where an organism can grow, but it's not going to do the very, very, very best. It's gonna struggle a little bit. Okay, but it can still survive. So basically, every species has an optimum range, zones of stress, and then limits of tolerance, or a range of tolerance, okay, with respect to every single abiotic factor. And a population is going to have the most density, the most individuals per area in places where conditions are optimal, because they're gonna want to hang out in the best place rather than the okay place, right? I mean, if you had a choice, you'd rather go to the best place rather than the okay place, right? So, and again, a limiting factor is anything that limits growth. And we've talked about some of these a little bit, the law of limiting factors, Liebig's law of the minimum, and it's basically you can have too much of something or too little of something. So, for example, people often assume that plants love light, which is true, they do, but you can have too much light. There are some plants that are considered like shade plants, and if you put them out in the middle of a field where there's no shade, they'll actually will die and won't do well because they've got too much sun. Same with water, right? My husband likes to tell this story where he had a cactus and he went out of town for a few months and he told his mom, he said, watch my cactus, don't kill it, right? Well, she was so worried that she was going to kill his cactus that she watered it every day. A cactus does not need water every day. So because she watered the cactus too much, she actually ended up killing the cactus because she gave it too much water. And now my husband likes to tell everyone that his mother can even kill a cactus because, cactuses are supposed to be pretty easy to take care of, but she took too much care of it. And so it died. So your habitat is where you live. The plant community and the physical environment determine your habitat. So, for example, let's say pandas. We talked about pandas earlier. Pandas like to live in places with lots of bamboo, right? There's also a specific temperature range that they probably like. They probably don't like it to be too hot, given that they're like giant fuzzy bears. And also they probably, whatever rain is best for bamboo is probably good for pandas, since pandas like bamboo and they want to live where bamboo is. So that would be their habitat, some sort of bamboo forest or something like that. Now your niche is, we've talked about this a little bit before, but it's where your specific place in the environment, like your very specific, just for you spot, okay? So it includes what the animal eats, or plant. Well, a plant wouldn't eat something, but where it feeds, when it feeds, where it finds shelter, how it responds to abiotic, where it nests. And only one species can occupy a particular niche or niche. Some people like it that way. So this is an interesting example. The Chithalamus barnacle, the brown ones, they actually can survive all the way to low tide. They're very hardy. They can survive all the way up to the top, but they can actually also survive all the way down here. Okay. Balanus, however, can only survive right about here, which is, they call this like the mean water line. They can't handle being out of water for too long, so they can't go all the way to the high tide line. They really like the mean water line is best for them. Mean water line or below. And Balanus is actually a superior competitor. Balanus is a much better being a barnacle, I guess, than Chithalamus. So when the two of them can survive, when the two of them are in the same environment, Balanus is going to get what you would consider maybe like the sweet spot or the best location right down here, where you've got more water and stuff like that. That's where Balanus is going to hang out because they're a superior competitor to Chithalamus. But Balanus cannot live above this mean water line, and so Chithalamus hangs out up there. So Chithalamus's niche, when they're together, ends up being up here, and Balanus' niche ends up being down here when they're together. So you can also discuss something called a functional niche or a realized niche. So your functional niche would be the entire place that you could live. So for Chithalamus, it would be this entire area, low tide line to high tide line. But then your realized niche is due to competition. That's the only place you really occupy in the environment. So Chithalamus's realized niche is above the mean water line to high tide. So this little area right here. So that's just an example of niches. So now we can talk about biomes. So basically for each biome, there's a predictable set of organisms that tend to live in those biomes. And then the biomes are usually named after the dominant type of vegetation there. And a lot of times, again, the biomes have fuzzy edges, right? They're not like, you're not going to have, you see, like these are two, like grassland would be a biome and forest would be a biome. Well, this ecotone right here is that fuzzy edge where you've got a little bit of both, okay? So they're not going to be, it's not like there's a brick wall in between. Okay, so you can see they're named after the dominant vegetation. The grassland, it's grass. And the deciduous forest, it's deciduous trees. And then there's a predictable set of organisms that would live in either one of those. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today a little bit. So to discuss a biome, you've got to discuss its climate, because that's what basically determines the plant life in a biome. And then the plant life plus the climate determine the animals that live in a biome. So what we like to say is that weather is what you get and climate is what you expect. So, and my dad has a lot of trouble with this concept. He always calls me when it's really cold outside. He'll say, so tell me about that global warming again. Dad, it's not global warming, it's global climate change. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So your climate is basically a description of the average temperature and precipitation of an area. So for example, in Georgia, you can expect it to be relatively warm in September. There may be some days where it's cold. For example, I have this app on my phone called Time Hop, and a couple years ago, it was actually kind of chilly today. So that was the weather, right? That the weather of it being chilly that day was the weather. I think there was a hurricane coming through. It might have been last year. And then, but in general, I can expect in September in Georgia to be wearing shorts and a t-shirt in general. You know, I'm not going to get out my heavy winter coats yet, right? Because I don't expect it to be cold in September, okay? So the climate is the average temperature and precipitation, what you'd expect in that area over time. So for example, if I was going to go visit New York City this week, I might bring a light jacket because you know, it might start to get chilly at night. I don't even know. I've never been to New York City in September. But it might start to get kind of chilly there at night, but overall it's probably still pretty warm up there right about now. And so I would probably mostly pack shorts, maybe some jeans or something like that, just, you know, to wear jeans. But, you know, I'm not going to bring my heavy winter coat and gloves and hat and that stuff because I don't expect it to be that cold. Get there, it's entirely possible. There could be a cold front come through or something like that. And then I'm like, oh, darn, I really should have brought my hat. But I wasn't expecting it to be that cold this trip, okay? So weather are short-term variations in the atmosphere. So I have a Weather Channel app on my phone, and I check it, and it says, oh, it's supposed to rain tomorrow. So I might put a raincoat in my kid's backpack, right? Or it may say that it's going to be cold one morning. Then, you know, we might put on a sweater. But overall, even if I don't look at the weather and I just kind of like go in my kid's room tomorrow morning to pick him out some clothes, I'm going to pick him out shorts and a t-shirt because it's most likely, more than likely not going to be warm because, you know, the climate of where we live is warm at this time of day or this time of year. So, this is an interesting question that I've seen on the biodiversity test. for a few of y'all, where they talk about describe the relationship between increasing latitude and increasing altitude. Okay, so the closer to the poles you are, the longer and colder your winters become. Okay, so if this is Earth, here and here, you've got like max winter, basically, right? And here, the equator, you've basically got like max summer. Okay, so this is going to increase your latitude, and this is going to increase your latitude. So as your latitude increases, it's going to be colder, right? Okay, same with altitude, which is the picture we have here, right? The higher up you get on a mountain, or the farther you get from sea level, the colder it's going to be. Now, because the temperature or the climate determines the plant life in an area, the top of the mountain is going to have similar plant life to these areas in the poles that have max winter, because they both have similar similar climates. They're both very, very cold most of the time. Just like down here, and this is like if we were at the equator, right? So you can have a tropical rainforest here, a sea level, and you can still have basically like a, you know, Arctic type environment at the top. There's a mountain in Africa called like Mount Kilimanjaro, and you can see it, and at least you used to be able to see that, like, you know, you had like the savanna grassland or whatever, like lions and stuff, and then you have Mount Kilimanjaro, and you could see like snow at the top, and that's because of the high latitude, even though, you know, you are close to the equator. So same thing with precipitation. So some places can have precipitation close to zero, and some places can have lots and lots and lots of precipitation. And you can have what I would consider like warm or hot precipitation, or hot dryness and cold dryness. So for example, if your temperature is hot and it's dry, you're going to have your typical desert, right? Hot, dry, desert. Okay, but then you could have up here, you could have a place where it's cold and dry, and that would be like a tundra, okay, a dry tundra. And then you could have the same thing over here. You can have a tropical rainforest where it's wet and hot, and then you could have a place where it's wet and cold. Okay, you're still not going to have as many trees and things in your moist tundra or your wet and cold area because of that elevation issue, or of the temperature issue. But you can still have like cold, wet areas. It's not like cold areas are always dry or hot areas are always dry. You can have hot, dry areas and hot, wet areas, and you can have cold, dry areas and cold, wet areas. So this is just a quick table with all of the terrestrial biomes, the major ones. Your deserts are hot and dry. Your grasslands are also dry, just not as dry. And then your rainforest is going to be, so this is like most dry to least dry in the like around the center of the equator. And then you can kind of go up a little bit, some latitude, and you'll have that temperate forest, your coniferous forest, and then your tundra. Your tundra is very, very cold. Some places it doesn't even stop. It's frozen all year round under the soil. And this will tell you the dominant animal life right here, the dominant plants, you get your climate. Here's some aquatic ones. We'll talk more about aquatic biomes next week and some kind of special considerations for an aquatic biome. There's some things that are different about them besides just that they're wet. But again, you can see the dominant vegetation, the animal life, that kind of thing. And then I just wanted to use this word permafrost because I just mentioned the permanently frozen. Permafrost is basically soil that is under the regular layer of soil. So you can see, like in this picture, that would be like the regular soil on the top, and then this would be like permafrost. What's interesting is because your soil is so thin and then underneath it's frozen, you can't, trees won't grow because the trees can't penetrate that frozen area. And then this permafrost, what's interesting about it is you can actually take what they call, you may have heard of ice cores. They can drill ice cores like down into the permafrost and take like this whole core, and they can see like carbon dioxide and oxygen levels in the atmosphere at like different times in history. So that's how they get our like historical carbon dioxide or historical oxygen levels. A lot of times they get that from permafrost with these ice cores. And then really productive biomes like rainforests and coral reefs, they can actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so they can be considered like a carbon sink. So they can take carbon dioxide out in the atmosphere, so it's not so much. The problem is we produce more carbon dioxide than these ecosystems can remove. And so that's why the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere keeps increasing, in addition to the fact that when you remove a rainforest, then it's no longer removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so the carbon dioxide that would have been lowered by having that forest is actually going to be that much higher. So we consider that like a positive feedback loop, because as the carbon dioxide increases, you know, then maybe like a coral reef will die because it gets too acidic in the environment because it's absorbing. And then if the coral reef dies, then it can't absorb as much carbon dioxide, so then the carbon dioxide in the environment gets even more, which then, you know, puts more into the ocean, makes it even more acidic, and then more die, and, you know, we can have this this feedback loop. So that's kind of the basics of what I wanted to talk to you about biomes. I didn't go into each individual biome with too much detail, because I know that that is a topic that you probably learn about pretty well in biology. And so I wanted to talk more about the kind of the behind the scenes of the biomes, if you will, like what determines them and things like that. But these are your different biomes if you need them. Your major terrestrial biomes, you may see some other ones like taiga, places, things like that. But these are your basic terrestrial biomes, and these are your basic aquatic biomes. And we'll talk more about aquatic ecosystems, especially marine and fisheries and things like that next week.